This is Inner Healing Paths podcast. Here we discuss the healing of the mind, body, soul, and spirit through a variety of different paths. We have emotional and spiritually minded conversations centering on ancestral healing, psychology, astrology, yoga, meditation, magic, and indigenous spiritual practices of the world. I am your host, Rosa Shetty, and I am so happy you are here. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. I am your host, Rosa. And for this episode, I had the opportunity to sit with Miriam Lara-Mejia. She is known as La Gorda Feminista on social media. And Miriam is a mother. She's an anthropologist, a writer, a speaker, an educator on body positivity and size diversity. And she came on the podcast to talk about what is fat phobia, what is the connection between our body, self-shame, and collective fat phobia. She came on and shared so much wisdom on why it's important to focus on size diversity, body diversity from a very young age, how we can start teaching our children these concepts. Miriam also talks about how she's been able to heal alongside her career as a content creator, and how learning about this, researching, and how education can be so empowering and such a huge component of healing, which is why she's so passionate about sharing this information, sharing this knowledge to everyone. And one of the things that I appreciate about Miriam so much is just how generous she is in sharing all of this information, not just on the podcast, but if you go to her social media, whether it's her TikTok or Instagram or YouTube, she just drops so much knowledge, so much wisdom, but in a way that is relatable, in a way that is funny and very much digestible to everyone from all walks of life. And I just so appreciate her perspective on how she discusses or tackles very complex, complicated topics in such a straightforward, simple way. I just love her Instagram, and I encourage you all to check it out. Please know that this episode is not meant to treat or diagnose any physical or mental health condition. This episode does not substitute for healthcare or mental health services. Guests have a right to share their opinion and perspective, and this does not constitute an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. So without further ado, here's my interview with Miriam Lara-Mejia. Take a listen. Welcome, Miriam, to the podcast.
Hola, hola. Hi, everyone. So excited to be here.
Thank you so much for your time and for your willingness to share with myself and my audience today.
Yes, I'm excited. I was really excited when you reached out, and the opportunity of connecting with different communities is really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get started. And just to begin, can you tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and the work that you do?
Yeah, so my name is Miriam Lara-Mejia, and I'm a body positive parenting educator and activist. And I was born in Mexico. My mom is from Wisconsin, though. So I often think of myself as a immigrant American to Mexico, because I grew up in a household that was very, very Midwestern in Mexico. And yet I also had the opportunities, there's a power dynamic of being someone with an American heritage in Mexico. So I got to experience Mexico in a different way. And yeah, I'm an anthropologist in my studies and gender studies as well. And I've been in the body positive movement for a long time. But of course, like many people during that pandemic, and we saw a lot of people talking about their bodies and talking about other people's bodies. And I have been doing most of my work in English. I live in California, and I work in, have kind of worked always in English dominant spaces. But during the pandemic, it became clear that I wanted to talk about these things. I want to talk about fat phobia and weight stigma. I wanted to talk about the trauma of constantly being criticized in our homes. And I was talking to my mother-in-law, who is of Colombian descent, and she was so literally in every conversation that we have, she talks about someone's weight. And so I realized I wanted to create content to educate people about the harm of fat phobia, the harm of weight stigma, the harm of this constant criticism. And I wanted to do it in Spanish because I feel like there's this great power to reach a lot of people, right? But also there was there was nothing in Spanish, nothing in Spanish in the US, right? There's a lot of activism in Latin America and a lot of activism in Spain. But in the US, there's a lot of activism around body positivity and fat liberation, but not in Spanish, right? And as a parent, it became clear that a lot of us are trying to break cycles. We're trying to do things, more aware of the trauma that we have lived. I realized that I really wanted to focus on Latinx kids in the US and, still with a big audience in Latin America, but speaking really about the experience of first gen and immigrant communities here, with a full acknowledgement that I, again, live in California. I live in Northern California, where I am very privileged to not constantly be I don't face criticism from my in-laws all the time, right? It's like once a year. But a lot of people that are part of my community do, right? Constantly, right? In las fiestas de las tías and right? Like, and so there's a lot of work to be done there to talk about this trauma and to be part of the generation that is working to shift it, right? It's very clear that we have all lived some form of this. Either we did it or we lived it. None of us are exempt from being people who also are part of a community, a part of a paradigm that believes fat people are lesser humans. We have all been part of that. So, so now I do a lot of workshops and I create content on social media, which I think is a great equalizer, right? It's a lot of people, a lot of eyeballs looking at content. I truly believe in this process of demystifying information. There's so much content, there's so much out there, right? But how do we make it really accessible and useful, right? And a lot of people use my content and they send it in the WhatsApp groups to the tias, so to them, oh, look at this thing, right? And it's a way of starting conversations. And now I've been focusing a little bit more on curriculums for schools, really bringing this conversation around body diversity, centering body diversity as this big chunk of diversity that we've missed, that we can all look around and be like, wow, bodies come in all different shapes and sizes. Why do we not include them in our conversations around diversity? So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing that information. And I was just wondering, so you mentioned that you were an anthropologist by training, right? Or yeah. And how has this, your career as an anthropologist, how has it, have you always been interested on these topics, or has it evolved, or from the very beginning you were, this was your area of focus?
No, I mean, I grew up in an activist home and in a feminist home, both of which I often talk about being key elements of my journey into this world, right? Of what I believe around social justice. In my home, we activated around several different issues, including women's rights, women's reproductive health, worker rights, because I was born and grew up in a town in Mexico that was the jean, the clothing jean capital of the world, where lots of maquilas, lots of factories were making jeans, a lot of issues around worker health and a lot of issues on environmental concerns. So I've always been activated in some way or form. In my university, for example, I, was part of the group pushing for different not legislation, but different rules, guidelines in the school around sexism and, discrimination against women and all kinds of things. So I feel like I've identify as an activist because it is definitely something that I'm close to. As always, it's like this sort of thing, right? Like as soon as you start activating on something, you realize, oh, For example, worker rights.
Right.
Like, yes, like let's talk about worker rights and people in factories making the things that we use all the time. But then you have to talk about environmental rights, because you can't suddenly it's like that's a whole other thing, right? And then you talk about, yeah, it's like we want factories to be in workplaces where there's no jobs, like this kind of, and then we talk about migration, like it's all interconnected, right? So my family has always had a larger body. My mom, I was actually interested in this a long time ago because my grandfather, who was Irish descent, and then my mom and my uncles, and then us, we all have the same body. That's literally like, it's like a specific kind of body, and we all have the same body. And that was interesting to me when I was a teenager, because I was like, there's just clearly something here, right? Without knowing, now I know the data around, genetics being the most significant element around what determines our body size. But I didn't know that then, right? I was just sort of like, how is this possible, right? And my mom, I always talk about, even though I grew up in a feminist home, I grew up like all of us in a fatphobic home, because my mom, I don't remember a time that she wasn't doing a diet, right? She wasn't trying to do something to change her body, right? And now we know that diets are, this is the current studies say, like, doing a diet is the number one predictor of weight gain in the future, because diets have this huge impact on how our bodies function, right? And our bodies, when they're put in stress, they want to save the energy, right? So I have always been aware that, as a person with a larger body, I've experienced fat phobia in different ways. I didn't know that was called fat phobia. And I think many people who maybe are listening might have that experience, right? Like, when you don't know that this is a thing that's happening, you feel like you deserve it, right? A lot of fat people feel like we deserve the acoso, the harm, the harassment, the violence, because we also believe that people deserve to be treated that way, right? And it's not until you start learning about these incredible systems, fat phobia and weight stigma and anti-fat bias, and you're like, wait a second, this is like a societal perspective that has decided that people in larger bodies are inferior, just as a rule, right? And so now that I've been activating in fat phobia, I've been like, wait a second, that thing that happened to me, I didn't see it as fat phobia because I didn't know even if that was a thing. But I would say, like, I started really activating around the body positivity movement 10 years ago when I moved to the Bay Area. And I have this story about how I wanted to dance samba, Brazilian samba, and how I sort of like was like always shamed for my body when I wanted to perform. And I kind of couldn't understand that. I couldn't understand why, if I was such a great dancer, I couldn't just, do the thing, until I had this big revelation with following more body positive content and realizing, like, no, I deserve to dance in the body that I don't have to change my body to belong. I can do the thing, right? And activating around those spaces really, was the kind of the first seed for me that something was wrong with how we think that we have to be different to deserve love. We have to be different to deserve opportunities. We have to be different to exist in this world. And I would say really, really the key catalyst moment has been like in the last 3 years when I've really educated myself around the science. Like, what do the studies around weight and health say? What about the health in every size movement? Not only like the activist side, but the science side, the academic side. And that's when everything, it almost feels like, and maybe you've had this experience, but it almost feels like I've had all these building blocks kind of like all over, like, all over my experience. And then suddenly they all like connected, right?
Yeah.
The idea of like believing that all humans deserve love, dignity, health, no matter who they are, what they look like, right? And so all my social justice activism and all my interest, I worked for 15 years in a nonprofit that wrote health resources, again, with this idea of like, we need to make health information actionable for people. And I truly, that's like the core of my work around social media, especially the idea of like, how do we make information that help someone wherever they are, kind of be part of that building block, being like, wait a second, that is not that what's happening to me is not okay, right? And for so many people, a big alarm that has happened, and maybe in the last 2 years, is this idea of like recognizing fat phobia in our families and being like, it's that time that your tia is criticizing what you eat, what you wear, your weight, all these things isn't okay. Even if it's like the norm, and even if it's the culture, even if it's whatever, right?
Yeah.
So beginning to question that is a big piece of where I see my work.
Yeah, so fascinating and so interesting. And I was going to ask you, but I think you answered this question just in your story. But, a lot of folks, as they do the work, the healing work, and share the work with others, indirectly or directly, they heal from their own wounds, their own shame, their own bias. So my question to you was going to be, how has your healing journey unfolded? But it sounds like for you, through all this education and just reading and integrating and sharing it with the community and the activism, all of this has helped you integrate this for your own healing, for your own unlearning everything that you've done has helped you also in a more deeper way.
Yeah, I would say so. But I also think that, I mean, we are part of our culture, right? And so I don't believe that there's a true healing around body image, because we're constantly getting attacked by it, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So what I like to see it more as like a cultivation of awareness, right? Like, especially, people who are listening, right? Like when you feel bad about your body one day, and then the next day you don't feel bad about your body, right? Like, in a week you'll feel like fine. That there's a lot of messaging, right? And so learning to kind of be able to see what's happening. Maybe I need to like step away from my social media. Maybe I need to not go to that party. Maybe a lot of these different things of like how to be able to recognize the messaging that we all know is harming us.
Right.
But, yes, I think that we live in this society. This society puts a lot, especially for Latinas, a lot of attention and a lot of pressure on bodies, what your body looks like, have you aged, is your hair, all these things, right? And we are not devoid of our society and of our community.
No, our
So it's
culture,
about like
family,
like kind of like cultivating the tools to be able to recognize, okay, today, I feel like this, I think like this. I also recognize these are not, I like to say we are all born body positive, right? We are all born embodied into our bodies, right? And we learn to hate our bodies. We are taught that we are not good enough. We are taught that our curly hair is not good enough, our straight hair is not good enough, our this skin or that skin, right? And plus other things. And so the idea of like kind of going back to honoring that source that we were born with, right? And recognizing the messaging external to us that has taught us to hate our bodies, right? And in that process to hate others, right? Like when you hate your body, you also judge and hate other people's bodies for their differences. And so it's a little bit of cultivating this dynamic between you and the world.
No, but I think you're spot on with the awareness. Sometimes, and that's what education does, right? It gives you that awareness of, well, maybe what I thought or what my mom or tia, whomever, that's not okay. And that starts with just being aware of when it's happening, right? The mindfulness of when it's happening in the moment and being able to respond to that in the moment. And you mentioned something that is so interesting, because I know I go through this. You mentioned that one day we're fine with our body, we're fine, we feel good. And then a few days later, you start feeling all kinds of way. You start feeling so just judging yourself, and you start feeling shame, and you don't even know what to wear. I know that's, happens to me, where sometimes I nothing fits, nothing looks good, and then, and I've never, until you mentioned it, I never realized to ask myself in those moments, what is it that I've been exposed to? Who has said something to me? What have I seen? Because that is a direct influence to our mind, our spirit. And I just thought it was so interesting, that because I think so many people can relate to that moment of like, I was fine last week, but this week I'm not. I don't feel good.
Yeah. And because you have seen it, right? Like, it's like your body didn't change that much from one week to another, right? So it's clearly something in your mind, right? And it's clearly something in your relationship to your body. And I would like to say also, especially for women and people who have uteruses, The thing is, like, our bodies do change month to month, and our bodies do change, there's this sort of like glorification of the unchanging body, right? But it's like our bodies change. Yeah. So yeah, sometimes it's like, for me, I can tell it's like, okay, maybe my period's going to start or something. And yes, my body is different. But we have this disassociation with our body, right? Because we're not supposed to get bigger. We're not supposed to do all these things. And that is informing this thing that we can be honoring and celebrating about our body, or recognizing like, yes, today I'm maybe, this way or that way. But of course, there's other messaging around like, how we think about eating or how we think about movement that are both really deeply informed with this anti-fat bias that, is truly harmful, because it keeps us in this loop of dissatisfaction. But yes, I kind of like, when the moment where you can be like, I can recognize that this is something that is changing. Our relationship to our body is changing, not only by our bodies, but yes, like what you're consuming, what you're reading, messages that you haven't yet processed, messages that you still need to kind of work on and, work through therapy or, whatever. And I would say it's not just education, but also I do believe in the incredible power of social media. Like, I follow so many fat creators and people with all kinds of different bodies. And I have seen this true transformation in my brain of like things where I would normally be like, oh my gosh, mira no más que gorda, or whatever, like things that like are truly informed by fat phobia. Now that I see so many different bodies, I sort of can see the uniqueness of my own. And that's one of the first things I tell people to do is like go and follow fat creators, go and follow people with all different kinds of bodies, because it transforms the way you judge your body when you can see so much diversity.
So beautiful. And you talk a lot about that concept of body diversity, size diversity. For the folks that may be unfamiliar with that term, how would you describe it in relation to what we're talking about and fat phobia?
Well, I mean, I went to school the other day. I did a reading for a second grade class, and it was the first time that they'd ever heard the word or the phrase body diversity. And I said, look around. Are we all the same? No, right? There's people who are taller and shorter and bigger and smaller and have all kinds of cares. That is what body diversity is. Body diversity is the understanding that every single body in this world is different. Now, the reason why we celebrate and we focus on body diversity is because diet culture and white supremacy has taught us that there's only one good body, right? Only one good hair, only one good nose, only one good eye, only one good of everything, right? What's funny about this is that when we start really connecting with our community, or like, for example, I always ask, tell me who in your life, who, especially a woman, tell me a woman in your life that feels really good about her whole body. And you start to realize that no matter what kind of body people have, la alta, la baja, la gorda, la flaca, nobody feels good about their bodies. So then now we know that this is a symptom of a society that has glorified this one kind of characteristic that no one fits in. There is nobody that has a perfect body. Let's look at the Kardashians. The Kardashians are always celebrated as like, wow, the most amazing bodies. And you see the incredible body satisfaction that they have, right? Because they need to always be changing even their perfect, amazing, beautiful body. So this idea of the ideal body is the only way we can kind of reject and challenge that concept is by celebrating body diversity, is by acknowledging the uniqueness of all of our different kinds. And it is hard, right? Because like when you open a magazine, especially, we have a lot of trends, right? And now you see the trend is this haircut and you don't have that haircut. Okay, the haircut is okay. But what if you suddenly see big butts, but big butts are the big thing? You don't have a big butt. Okay, now you're like in this process. What should you do? What measures should you take? What harmful measures should you take to suddenly have that same body as that person? Well, I personally believe like we should be challenging that instead of saying like, let's change our body, right? What next things will there be? Like, the whitening creams, like, should you be using whitening creams because now they told you that white skin is the only good skin? Should you be using lip fillers to only have the lips that like now they're telling you, right? This is the question that we're like in this balance. But when we center body diversity as part of our practice on body positivity, it allows us to see ourselves as just the unique human that we are part of body diversity. Everybody is part of body diversity. That's the whole point. Every single human has unique qualities and special characteristics and all these things that make them them. And there's no hierarchy. We just are all in this line of incredible diversity. So I always like to invite people to look at their friends, to look at their families, to look at their community, to see and start to acknowledge body diversity. And like part of this work, for example, for me as a, fat liberation activist too, is I want to be able to say the fat people, fatness and fat is just an adjective, but for so many people they can describe tall, la flaca, all these things, and they can never say fat, right? Because fat is the worst thing you could be. And yet there's so many fat people, and there's so many fat people that we know and we love, and we might be the fat person, right? And we can call ourselves, we can name our diversity, and that is still good. So I really, really think that so much of our work has to center on acknowledging our uniqueness and embodying our diversity, because it is through that we can sort of challenge the white supremacy of diet culture and the ideal body.
Wow, so powerful. And you mentioned earlier on that you also do parenting class, or you're focusing on parenting education.
I'm focusing on what I call body positive parenting.
Okay. The reason why I'm asking is because as you were sharing and with the you share the story about going to elementary school and talking to these children, I believe that as parents, we can tell our kids everything about being, loving themselves and their body and all that. But if we don't practice it,
yes,
that's what the kids are going to see, and that's what they're going to do.
yes.
And I know for me, a big catalyst to heal my, my relationship with my body and all of that has been having a daughter and wanting her to not go or experience the things that I've been through, right? The body shaming and the self-criticism and harshness that came from my mom, really, and probably from her mom, and back the lineage. But so that's been a huge catalyst for me. And so tell me a little bit about how are you, what is it that you're sharing with parents, and how has that been part of your work and the journey that you're on, and with your Instagram and your education?
Well, I would say, anybody that has birthed a human being, when they come out, you're like, you're precious, right? You're so precious, and you want them to grow up knowing that, right? And yet society tells us a lot of stuff around, like, how do we talk about food and movement and all these things, right? And also what you said about ourselves. And so we end up actually teaching and perpetuating really negative beliefs around people's bodies, especially for our kids. So my biggest sort of catalyst around body positivity for parenting really came from doing a workshop around eating disorders and the role of the family in the risk for developing eating disorders. And eating disorders are, they're so much part of a conversation, but in fact, they're like the number 2 of all the mental health diseases that has the highest risk of death, for example. These are really important impact that eating disorders have. And as I was kind of like reading all the literature, it was very like what you're pointing at is literally the point. It's like, we know one of the biggest impacts on what the role of the family around eating disorder development is whether the mom is dieting, and of course whether the mom encourages dieting in the person, the child, and all the other things that come with it, right? Like whether the mom criticizes other people's bodies. But mom dieting is a number 1 thing that has an impact in terms of, but so many of us have been in diets, right? Because that is literally what we are told. You should constantly be doing this diet, right? Now we know more about, intuitive eating or other forms of eating that are honoring our hunger, right? And learning about our bodies. And so that was kind of like the first thing, like what do we have to do if we really believe our child deserves to feel good in this world? What do we have to do? And you pointed at it, that is literally the work. You have to do this healing. You have to work on your relationship with food. You have to work on your relationship with your body. You have to work on your relationship with movement. It doesn't mean you have to be like healed. Like, this is the key part, is like, actually that process of working through those messages, of learning these things and unlearning these things, is powerful for our kids to see too, right? To see you, yeah, like, yes, the world is telling you you have to be all these different things. How are you working through that, right? So definitely parents, the role of like parents working through those things is the most important thing. Other aspects, and I feel like it depends on the age, of course, on the age of the child or the teen. And I don't think that there's this thing like, oh, if you didn't do it from the beginning. No, like we can always, this is stuff that we're like unlearning. Like society right now, we're like in this current moment where so many of us are unlearning the kind of body criticism that many of us grew up with, that we can know has a huge impact. I get so many messages of people who are like in their 60s who can tell me the words that their mom used when they were like 8 years old, or the trainer or the teacher. I mean, it's so, your words have impact, right? And so I always tell parents, like, we have the opportunity to be positive influences in this or negative influences in this. And here's the data. Like, the data is very clear about what kind of language we use and how it will impact our kids in the future. So I also talk about like centering body diversity, being very conscious about how we include body diversity in the media and in the books that we consume, right? Also in the awareness of our world. Like, I really love pointing out body diversity for my child constantly, right? Like, but diversity in general, but just the idea of like bodies coming all different sizes. I think that people who work on disability justice are a great source, because when we talk about disabilities, we're so used to being like, that person doesn't have a leg, right? Or whatever. And in fact, that person has a leg, right? Like, that is their body. We don't have to constantly be like, the only body that's good is one that has 2 legs. No, it can be a person that has 1 leg, and that is just how that person is, right? That kind of certainty that bodies come in different ways is so powerful. And I see it all the time with little kids, especially when they realize like, that is just how they are. That just how you are this way, that is just how they are. And that is incredibly powerful. At the same time, I think that not only consuming media that has great body diversity, like, we also can teach our kids to question why they don't see body diversity. I mean, especially like, I'm part of a big group of like Latinx publishers publishing, whatever, creators. And that's the question, how many, there's like 1% of like children's books are written by Latinx people, which means that true representation of Latinx kids is not there, right? So how do we question that? How do we question, the fact that you see a lot of books, you can look around you and see so many fat people, but you don't see any fat people in books. Where are they? Why aren't they there? We can do a lot of work by questioning what isn't there as much as like celebrating what is there. I think the questions around intuitive eating, there's more and more awareness about intuitive eating with kids, how to really understand that kids are learning about food, and we can help them have a really positive relationship with food. So get educated about that. I also, because one of the elements of my content is around movement, a lot of people who have larger bodies, we've gotten the message that like, we need to move as punishment for being in larger bodies, right? We need to move to lose weight. And it turns out the science is very clear. Like, in the long run, like, movement is not a good weight loss strategy, but movement is really good for like all kinds of really positive things for health, right? Stress management and like all kinds of things around ADHD, all kinds of things. So when we like shift the focus from weight loss to movement for health, it blows our kids' minds. It blows our mind as well, right? So I made a video recently about how like, on Wednesdays, my husband and I always do a routine, whatever, like push-ups, whatever, in the morning. And I made the switch when, my son wakes up and he's like, oh, I need this. And I was like, I need to get out. I need to go finish my routine. And I realized just this small change when I said, I want to go change. I want to go finish my routine. I want to. This is something I want. I don't have to. It has no, like, I just want to, right? And encouraging healthier relationships with movement And finally, I do think like this is the truth, is like our kids will go into the world and the world is filled with all these messages around bodies. What we want from them is to be able to have a little bit more tools to be able to recognize their uniqueness in the world that is constantly telling them that they should be blah, 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 blah.
Giving them a little buffer, right?
A little buffer,
Yes.
also, I also talk about parenting, but I know a lot of people who consume my content are not parents. They're like tias or tios, people who are doing this work, this kind of healing work that you were talking about. And they're just peripheral to like the la sobrina, el sobrino. You can still do a lot of these things. You cannot parent that child. That's not your child to parent, but you can be a place of
It's a huge
safety.
influence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can be a place of comfort. You can be a place. I always also say we have a lot of power to interrupt, to be interrupters of these, like what you call, this intergenerational trauma that is this, sort of like focus on weight, criticism on weight. It's not the same as a parent doing it, but you still have a lot of influence. And then also, I think that there's this conversation around the inner child. A lot of these tools, suddenly when you're like, I remember when my mom said that. I remember when that happened. I remember all these different things. There's a lot of work that we can still do, to heal our inner child. And so, for example, I have a Spotify playlist that's called Vibras Body Positive. It's like a body positive children's playlist that is in Spanish and English. And I realized that a lot of the people who are listening are on the younger side. Are on the older side. And I realized a lot of people want to hear these messages. They want to hear in this sort of very soft and tender and tierno way. They want to hear you're good. They want to hear you're okay. They want to hear you're unique. We didn't get those messages. And so a lot of people are even, this concept about body positive parenting is kind of like a little bit of healing that child inside of us as well.
Reparenting for ourselves, our younger
Yes.
Yeah.
And also, a lot of my community is like, well, you need to alejarte, you need to be away from your tios, your parientes that don't understand this. And I do believe that we can create content. I create content sometimes to reach them. It doesn't mean that we're going to change, it doesn't mean you're going to change people, right? Like, let's be truthful. We don't change people. We change ourselves. We give tools for people to change, but we don't change people. But I still feel like there's a lot of power there for people to, our older community to kind of question, and I use it a lot with my suegra, where like I can help her remember things that she experienced, the kind of this trauma and this violence that she experienced, and kind of plant the seed, like, that was not okay. Even if it happened to you, it is not okay. Right. So there's a lot of power in a lot of generations here.
Yeah, absolutely. Planting seeds, right? I think a lot of the work, the healing work, is that in and of itself, because that will be, eventually it will grow and it will manifest into other things. And yeah, absolutely. And Medium, one last question. How, in general, how would you say that the community is? I know your Instagram is on Spanish, and how has that message been received? How would you say in general has been received by the Spanish speaking community, not just here in the US, but in Mexico or South America? What has been how have people welcomed or not your message?
Yeah, really, I would say people really love when I do more of the skits where I can kind of play on this dynamic, right? Because people are experiencing it this real time, right? Constantly, la tía que te critica, like the making 1,000 tamales, but then criticizing you for eating the tamales. It's confusing, right? It's like
absolutely
one or the other. Like we either, but I have really carved a niche for myself in terms of really translating some of the information and data that we have into Spanish for like massive consumption. And I have grown a lot, when when I started, I was sort of like, what? Like who has these big accounts, you know? And now right now between TikTok and Instagram, I have like 360,000 followers.
Wow, that's
And
amazing.
kind of throughout the whole, US,
Yeah.
Mexico, Colombia, all the Latin
Yeah.
Americas, literally anybody, wherever there's people that speak Spanish, because I also have like a lot of countries in Europe. And I think that there is excitement about it. The reto, the challenge that I'm kind of focused on right now is that I really, in our community, in the Latinx community in the US, we see, for example, diabetes, and we see, a lot of issues around heart health. And there is a lot of information of how to approach these particular health problems with health at every size perspective, sort of a weight neutral perspective. And the science is actually pretty strong about this, because this is what people don't talk about, right? People say like, oh, people in larger bodies have more diabetes. But you know what? Who also has more diabetes? People that have stressful jobs, people that have 3 jobs, people that work the night shift, people that work, people that live in poverty, people that all these other things are factors. And so I like to, really focus on what we have. The science is like, while we see a correlation, we do not see a causation, right? Larger bodies and diabetes. We see a lot of causation with its other things, right? Also plus genetic, plus all these other things. So I think that there's great power in bringing an awareness of how to talk about people in all kinds of sizes with these health problems, especially because for our community, especially, when we know about around weight stigma, is that people don't want to go to the doctor because they will constantly be harassed about their weight. We know that as one element of weight stigma. We know that people that have thin bodies also get diabetes. So what kind of healthcare are they getting, and why are we not offering those same tools, evidence-based tools, to people in larger bodies, right? Like, it should be based on evidence and not on body size.
Right.
I want to talk with, I want to kind of bring more awareness about this, because there's a real choque. What I see is that in the spaces around public health that deal more with people who are white, we see a lot of understanding about this. We see a lot of really evidence-based information about the importance of being health for everybody, for all sizes, health at every size, I mean, and moving away from weight centering health. But in the Latinx side, we don't see that.
Oh,
and so I kind of want to move a little bit more towards that. I don't know yet, because there's so much, there's the basis for like really understanding weight centered stigma and anti-fat bias is we're still like we're still newbies here in the Spanish speaking world. And so, there's this question about where to go. But I really my current goals are really to kind of create more of a place where people can come and access all of these stuff, right? Where's the data on this? Where's the data on that? Like, what has been done on that? Like, let's like beyond the stuff that is like social justice, like no human being is lesser. No human being, no matter what their body size, is lesser than another human being. And that is currently the work, right? But there's a lot of like science about when we have focus on weight, it actually has not led to people having healthier lives. When we defocus weight, when we kind of have weight neutral approaches, we do see people having more health. So there's a real, and like, this might sound for people who are listening like, oh my gosh, this is nuevo, this is all new, but it's not. Like, I guarantee you, go look at public health departments in like all the different universities in the US.
Yeah. It's just so academic, right? It hasn't reached the people. It hasn't reached our communities, unfortunately. Still in academia, very, very
it's still
much,
in academia. And also it's like some sectors of academia, right? Like not all sectors that are really informed by racism, by, trauma, by discrimination. Like, those are the sectors that have really done the work to be like, hey, stigma, discrimination never will lead towards more health, right? But there are, of course, as with everything, a lot of interest, right? Monetary interest to keep people on weight loss drugs, for example, that on the long term are so hugely impactful and harmful, because we want to have people in smaller bodies, right? So it's really about moving from a thin-centered paradigm to a health-centered paradigm. And I know people were like, "Pero Miri, and the fat people." Yes, let's talk about it. Let's question these paradigms, because the science is coming. There's more and more research about this.
Wow, so fascinating. Just sitting here with you, I feel like I've had so many ideas just to apply in my life, to research. Like I mentioned, my daughter. Thank you so much for sharing this information. I don't think I've had anyone in the podcast that has talked about these things. So I appreciate it so much, because you mentioned inner child, and mentioned the healing, the planting seeds, and the trauma, and this is all part of it, right? It's in healing is not something that just happens with one. And this is why, my podcast is titled Inner Healing Paths, because there's so many paths that contribute to our healing, that contribute to our own personal liberation. And the more it's like peeling the layers, right? We address one component, and then we realize, wow, there's this whole other thing that is contributing to the way I feel. And so thank you for sharing your perspective, your wisdom with me and my audience. And for folks that would love to get to know you and your work, and maybe sign up for a class if it's available, how can people find you?
Yes, I am La Gorda Feminista, all together, on all the major platforms. And I do try to do mostly Spanish on TikTok and Instagram. And now I'm doing only English on YouTube, trying to figure out this balance, right? I think that anybody that's bilingual, we're like trying to figure out, like,
yes, I can relate to that.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, and I have a website, lagordafeminista.com, and you can reach me at Miriam, at lagordafeminista.com. And I want to end with this idea of, like, for a lot of people, we have lived for so long with so much shame and so much hatred towards our bodies. And so, and we feel like it's justified, right? Because if we just were skinny, we wouldn't have that. And I want to say that there's just, it's an incredible human experience to remind ourselves that from a place of love and from a place of acceptance, we are so much more able to do a lot of care for ourselves. And from a place of hatred and from a place of shame, we can't. And so, if you're listening to this and you're like, I don't even know where to start, I don't know what, I don't know what's going on. You can follow me, and then through there, see a lot of people who are doing this work, who are sharing tools. And a reminder, like, yes, social media has this one quality where you see someone, you're like, wow, they accept themselves. Why can't I? If someone makes you feel like that, don't follow that person, right? Like, the idea is, like what you said, I love what you said about the different paths. There's just like so many different ways. Nobody knows your context like you do, right? Your challenges, your privileges, your life. So use the tools, grab from where you can, what doesn't help you, what doesn't make you feel good, pa fuera, and just remember that this is a process. We're all in this process. There's no destiny. No one has gone to a destiny. We're all, like you said, in this inner healing path.
So beautiful. Gracias, Miriam.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope that you found it healing and nourishing to your mind and soul. If there's a friend that you think would benefit from listening to this information, please share it. Share about our podcast. If you feel called to, please leave us a review, as this really, really helps boost our presence here in Apple Podcasts, and it makes it easier for others to find us. To stay up to date on new episode releases and special events and projects that I'm working on, you can follow us on Instagram at Inner Healing Paths Podcast. And you can subscribe to my newsletter by going to my website, which is rosachettilcsw.com. And I will include this information and links in the show notes. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to sharing with you again next time.